We'll just start with TierZoo. Sloths used to have so much more going for them.
After the dinosaurs were nerfed, a lot of niches were left wide open. The power vacuum created a lot of pretty janky builds, most of which ended up getting nerfed in the final Ice Age balance patch. But nonetheless, some of the most interesting and unique builds of all time were part of the quaternary meta, and so I think it's time to finally create the Ice Age tier list. It's tough to make a fair tier list simply because just about every build that went extinct can directly or indirectly blame humans. Humans unlocking projectile weapons gave them such an oppressive advantage over large mammals that they became totally unstoppable in any server that lacked the proper counters. But since you should already be fully aware of how OP humans are, we're gonna kinda skip past them in this tier list and talk about the other great builds from the Ice Age meta. As always, we'll start from the bottom of the tier list and move up from there. In F tier we have the Megalosaurus, aka the giant deer build. This build holds the record for most evolution points put into the Antlers ability. Now, I've talked about the concept of diminishing returns before on this channel. For example, discussing how the poison dart frog having toxins that are strong enough to drop an elephant is probably a bit of overkill. But in that case, it's not that being too poisonous is a problem, it's just that some of those evolution points probably would have been better spent somewhere else. But in the case of the giant deer, not only is this level of antler growth excessive, it's genuinely detrimental.
I'm trying to remember if the giant deer is the same as the Irish elk. I'm not sure now. But that name always stood out to me because I know it's not exclusively Irish. I'll check and confirm or deny after this. Also, I'd have to say that my Ice Age animal knowledge is... So, this video is more for me to learn than anything else. And I do like TierZoo's ranking system. So, we'll see. I'd like to see Sloth at the top.
First of all, antlers have significant equipment load cost. Sprinting, fighting, or really just any everyday action costs more stamina when you're weighed down by heavy antlers, increasing the deer's food requirements and causing it to require rest more frequently. Second, antlers do break in combat quite frequently. While they're certainly powerful enough to defend from carnivore players, their purpose is to give male players a way to complete the alpha male and mating side quests, and are frequently broken during these challenges. With normal-sized antlers, this isn't too big an issue, but when they each weigh 40 pounds, a break to one antler might also mean a break to the neck, or at the very least, make it tough to maintain your balance.
I only recently found out that some modern-day deer lose their antlers every year and just regrow them. Had no clue.
Lastly, deer rely on stealth and mobility to evade attacks. The most common line of play is for deer to run to the safety of the forest, where they can hide much more effectively. Not only do antlers make it harder to run and make you stick out like a sore thumb, but their enormous hitbox makes it impossible to enter dense forest, a potentially game-ending limitation. Giant deer may have been nerfed in power and HP, but they were one of the few builds that were actually buffed overall in the final Ice Age balance patch. In D tier we have the Calicotherium, a horse build that's spec'd into tree browsing and forelimb claws, similar to the giant ground sloth. PBS Eons has already done an awesome video on the Calicotherium, so I won't spend too much time on it.
I know nothing about that.
I will say that unfortunately, unlike the ground sloth, Calicotheriums were significantly worse at combat than the giant sloths that they were trying to copy, and frequently got bodied by predators that ground sloths would have had no trouble fending off. I don't have too much else to say about this build, but yeah, horse mains, you've got a good thing going, you don't need to copy other builds.
I'll read about it.
In C tier we have the terror bird. Terror birds are basically an attempt to recreate the dinosaur build after non-avian dinosaurs were banned in the Cretaceous-Paleogene balance patch. And credit where credit is due, it does do a decent job of it. Terror birds were actually pretty OP in the early post-dino meta, having the best mobility and power at the time. However, as the meta
they probably have a
progressed towards the
bipedal
Ice Age,
advantage.
mammal builds finally unlocked better defensive and offensive tools to combat this playstyle. And while their high damage pack attack could still bring down a large mammal in a few hits, its damage is completely negated by armor, failing where a pre-patched dinosaur's crushing bite would have had no trouble. Mammals eventually developed high damage attacks of their own, leaving the terror bird player base with only one solid advantage, being able to stand on 2 legs. This is actually a pretty significant advantage, but it's best used in conjunction with powerful grasping or slashing forelimbs, a trait terror birds fail to take advantage of. Speaking of armor, next up on the tier list is the Glyptodon, the best armored build of the Ice Age meta. Glyptodons were pretty safe from predators, being able to block attacks from most of the common weapons at the time. They also possessed 2 powerful offensive moves, the first being Skull Bash and the second being Club Smash, a move reminiscent of the Ankylosaurus,
This looks like an
although
armadillo.
nowhere near as strong. They weren't by any means below average builds, but as a tank role I don't think they were near oppressive enough in terms of area denial for me to rate them any higher than B tier.
Okay.
Also in B tier we have the Woolly Rhinoceros, a more powerful version of the modern day Rhino build. Rhinos themselves are a tank variation of the horse build, and personally I don't see them as particularly viable in the modern day meta, due to a combination of two reasons: low intelligence and poor eyesight. This combination makes it very difficult for the rhino to determine friend from foe, and as a result, rhinos often team kill each other. They are hyper-aggressive, often attacking anything that they detect in their territory, which can include ridiculous things such as trees, rocks, and termite mounds. Anyways, I wouldn't put modern day rhinos any higher than D tier, but woolly rhinos, despite having the same issues, are powerful enough to earn a spot in B tier, just because of how important defense and offense was during this time. With the power creep starting to reach dinosaur levels, being able to defend yourself was critical, and the woolly rhinoceros had perhaps the most threatening weapon in the entire game at the time. Last in B tier we have the dire wolf. Dire wolves were the premier pack hunting build of the Ice Age meta. They were more powerful than any of the canine builds today, but actually on the weaker side when it comes to dogs throughout the Cenozoic meta. Earlier on, during the Oligocene and Miocene expansions that came just before the Ice Age, there were even stronger dogs, like the Borophagine and bear dogs. And yet it seems like the player base has constantly been shifting towards smaller, less powerful canine builds that were more agile and efficient. I think the reason for this is that the canine class in general is just best suited to the pack hunting strategy. Team strategy is perhaps the best way to take on builds above your weight class, but the thing to keep in mind is that if you're teaming up with other carnivore players, you'll need to split the loot from your kills. This gets to be a problem if your entire team is playing as the larger, more powerful dogs, because they have a much higher food cost. Since pack hunting is still plenty effective even when the individual members of a pack aren't particularly strong.
In one of the neighborhoods I lived in growing up, coyotes were a menace. And I'm not from a rural area or anything, they're just that adaptable. I think coyotes are all over North America. They're in Canada, Mexico, and I believe every state minus Hawaii. Don't quote me on that Hawaii thing, I'll have to check. But that makes sense to me because those are islands. It seemed as though every other night you would hear a pack of coyotes howling and a small dog barking, and you just knew that they were consuming someone's Chihuahua or Shih Tzu or other small domesticated dog breed. And the neighborhood would actually warn people that if they were going to walk at night, they had to or take a stick or take a can filled with coins in order to make noise and scare them away. But then sometimes in the day, you would see a solo coyote looking for food. And by themselves, they weren't much of a threat, just emaciated and pretty scared. So they're really the epitomization of stronger in a pack to me.
It makes sense why the dire wolf player base eventually shifted towards the smaller gray wolf build. Still, at the time, they were a force to be reckoned with, although they often were unable to defend their kills from the more powerful solo DPS builds of the Ice Age. All in all, not top tier, but by no means low tier. Alright, so in A tier we've reached builds that are all pretty much unimpeachably overpowered, and would still likely rule the meta today, if not for the absolutely broken build that is the human. First, let's talk about the most famous build from the Ice Age, the Mammoth. Mammoths had the highest HP of any Ice Age build, and also some top tier gear, second only to the woolly rhino. Mammoths, as well as elephants today, also had one of the most unique abilities ever seen in the game, a trunk. Choosing between a quadrupedal and bipedal build is a difficult choice. Quadrupeds are much more stable and tend to have higher run speeds, but using all four limbs to walk means you can't use them to grab or pick up items. Proboscideans like mammoths and elephants subvert this issue by putting enough points into the nose skill tree to unlock the trunk, basically giving themselves a fifth appendage. This is an extremely powerful and versatile ability that easily earns them a high tier spot. The only thing keeping them down is that they had an absolutely abysmal matchup versus humans. While many of the Ice Age mid-tier and top tiers had an unfavorable matchup against humans, the mammoths was especially terrible, because they're such a big target and worth so much XP. At the top end of A tier is the other Ice Age all-star, the Sabertooth. In terms of critical hit damage, nothing else even comes close to what sabers can dish out. Sabers actually had a different playstyle than the big cats of present day. Their lower agility made it tough for them to chase down prey, and so they had to use stealth not just to get close, but to get literally within range of a strike. They could take down basically anything that they wanted, but it's important to note that due to how fragile their fangs are, they couldn't use them in combat to deal damage to their foes. They were reserved specifically for finishing off a downed player. Their high power stat comes more from their bulky front limbs than from their teeth. While few builds could stand up to them, they did have a poor matchup against the next two builds on the list, the top tiers.
There's the sloth.
The first S tier is the giant ground sloth, a build I've discussed at length in my video about why sloths aren't OP anymore. But to recap, they could body just about anyone in a 1v1 match. And because they were one of the few mammals to pull off bipedalism correctly, they were much less vulnerable to stealth-based approach strategies due to their height. Check out this video for more info on it.
I will do.
Last on our list is the cave bear. Cave bears just had insane stats across the board. And here's the kicker, they were scavengers. You can't just put these kinds of stats on a scavenger. A bear this big could steal kills from entire packs of dire wolves or saber-tooths all by itself. But if there weren't any chumps around to do the bear's work for it, the bear could either take down some huge quarry by itself, or simply fall back on the numerous herbivorous options available to it. It's obvious that the devs had to nerf this build because it had basically no weaknesses. It's the only build on this list that humans are almost certainly not responsible for the extinction of. In fact, the reasons for the bear player base shifting towards the smaller bear builds aren't well understood by data miners at this point. All we do know is that when they were in the game, they were absolutely broken during a meta full of broken builds. If you like learning about builds from past expansions, there are tons of documentaries I'd recommend. My favorite is...
Okay, so bears stay dangerous. That's what I take out of that. The only two Ice Age animal facts that I have is, one, for a long time, I believed that mammoths were very large. And it turns out that they're not much larger than African elephants. And then dire wolves, there was a study that came out, I can't remember if it was 2020 or 2021. I'm going to look for it now, and I'll make sure to link it. That found that dire wolves were closer to jackals than they were wolves. I don't know why I find that one so deceiving. So this was TierZoo's Ice Age animal tier list. I'll make sure to link the channel for you down below. I've only watched 2 videos from this channel, but both of them were great. This was a subscriber request. Thank you for that. Not only did I learn about animals here, but I'm simultaneously growing more accustomed to listening to video game terminology in everyday conversation. So there's that. Now that I think about it, I don't really have a literary recommendation for you. Actually, the reason that I was reading about dire wolves was because I was reading A Song of Ice and Fire, which is the series that Game of Thrones is based off of. And I wanted to find out if dire wolves were real animals. It turns out, yes. So if you haven't read A Song of Ice and Fire, it is a good one. Epic fantasy genre. Multiple storylines. There are 5 books right now, I believe. When is the 6th one coming out? I don't know. But they say there is one coming out, so. I think you guys can probably think of an Ice Age related book better than I can. If so, please let me know the title. I have seen Ice Age the movie when I was a kid, if that counts for anything. Other than that, that's pretty much all I've got. So thanks for watching with me, and I'll catch you next time. Preview.